and welcome to Macros with Mythili, where we take a dispassionate view of all major macroeconomic developments, either those that are just over or those that are on the anvil. With Budget 2015-16 just round the corner, all eyes are on that crucial number, the fiscal deficit. The government's mid-year economic review has a simple answer. Fiscal consolidation, says the review, is best achieved through a judicious mix of reduction in total expenditure as a percentage of GDP and an improvement in the gross tax revenue, again as a percentage of GDP. Unfortunately, that's easier said than done. This is where the report of the Expenditure Management Commission, headed by Dr Bimal Jalan, comes in. The interim report of the committee has reportedly been submitted to the government recently, in time for it to take on board its recommendations while framing the budget. But can the expert committee really tell the FM anything that he doesn't know already? Remember, we've already had an Expenditure Management Committee in the past as well. It was headed by the former Finance Secretary, K.P. Geethakrishnan, and had submitted its recommendations to the then Finance Minister, Yashwant Sinha. But few of the recommendations really found the light of day, as governments always find it politically tough to cut expenditure. Will the fate of the new Commission's recommendations, submitted ironically to a ministry where Mr. Yashwant Sinha's son, Jayant Sinha, is a Minister of State, be any better? More importantly, will the government listen to its advice? And who better to discuss this than two of our most eminent economists, Saumitra Chaudhuri, former member Planning Commission, and Arvind Virmani, former CEA to Government of India. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Arvind, I'd like to start with you. You know, the first of the terms of reference of the new commission says, review the government expenditure and suggest ways of creating fiscal space to meet the requirements of development expenditure without compromising the commitment of fiscal discipline. Now, is that really possible in today's environment? Can you crunch expenditure, given the populist demands on government?
So let me come to the political economy question second. But as far as the fiscal deficit is concerned, I have been emphasizing for several years now that we should pay more attention to the revenue deficit, and I'll connect it with your question, than we have. We are talking only about fiscal because that is more important for credit rating and other things. But in my view, revenue deficit is neglected, but that is what affects national savings, because a large part of the savings come from government. So the other way to look at it, and coming to your expenditure question, is really you need to reduce the revenue deficit if you're going to shift expenditures from consumption to investment, and that's another part of what is needed. So if you look at it in that context, really the key issue for the budget and in some sense for the Expenditure Commission is how this shift is going to take place without affecting the overall deficit. I think the government has already stated on record that they are going to try and stick to the revenue deficit path, the fiscal path laid out. So the only way to get the shift in the quality of expenditure, so to say, from consumption expenditure to investment expenditure is by reducing the revenue deficit. So that is one issue. But on the political economy question of whether they can or will do it, I think that depends on the overall development approach. And I think there is much greater interest in improving governance. Now, what does that mean? We know, and government doesn't want to talk about it usually, there is a lot of corruption, and of course there's a lot of inefficiency. So there is, in my view, a huge margin there. If you really want to attack corruption and improve governance, which are difficult things, but this government, politically at least, has already committed to doing these things. So I'm a little more hopeful than perhaps before.
So, Saumitra, creating the fiscal space, is it a question of cutting down or reducing your expenditure, or is it of shifting your expenditure towards the right things?
There are several things involved. It's just not just a one-off thing that the only way to create a fiscal space, presumably for development expenditure, which is asset creation, capital investment, by reducing expenditure. That's not a simple. It's not a straightforward situation. One of the reasons why tax revenue, for example, in the last two budgets, both the July budget of 2014 and the previous budget missed its targets, is because of poor economic growth. We know taxes are actually buoyant with economic growth, and if economic growth picks up, tax revenues will also pick up, and you won't miss your target by 80, 70, 1 lakh crores, which is actually what is probably going to happen. And that will give you certain additional space without raising tax rates. It's simply leveraging on growth. The second part of it is what Arvind was speaking about, that on the expenditure side, there's lots of expenditures that we do which are done very badly and which can be improved. And some which is like, let's say in the case of oil subsidies, a bit of a bonanza, because the world oil prices are lower, so they're going to save a significant amount of money. But let's say, food subsidy, which is a very touchy issue, and people get very worked up about that, and quite rightly so. But the problem is you spend upwards of 100,000 crores, 1 lakh crores on food subsidy, and I can fairly confidently say at least 40% of the grain never reaches the intended beneficiary. It gets siphoned off along the way. So that's a lot of money. Now, either you can save the money or you can ensure that the grain reaches the beneficiary. Probably the second is a better alternative.
We've just got the recommendations of the Shantakumar committee. So will the government be able to do something like that? Cut down the coverage
Not
from
only there have been
67 to
many
40?
committees, there are 3 models which are tried out. There's a Chhattisgarh model, there's a Chandigarh model, and there's a Gujarat model. All 3 models have had varying degrees of success, and probably the Gujarat model, which is based on a voucher, and the Chandigarh model, which is based on a point-of-sale smart card, are probably the most promising one. Point-of-sale might work better in urban areas, and remote and rural areas, maybe voucher system will work. But this is something that we need to do, not just for ensuring management of the fiscal space, but also for sheer welfare gain. Why should you spend so much money and waste the money?
But can we reduce the coverage from 67% promised under the food security bill? Can we reduce the coverage without political repercussions which are so grave that no government can contemplate doing something like that?
No, I don't see why not, considering that, even when this food security bill was being discussed in the cabinet, there was a difference of opinion that, why should, for example, 67% of the rural population be entitled to this? So I think there was extremists there. Unfortunately, the bill was passed by unanimous support in Parliament.
Absolutely, because
so nobody can say I had a different view on that. So the point is, certainly, I think the most poor sections have a greater right on whatever subsidies government were to provide, and there's clearly a big difference between, let's say, the bottom 10 or bottom 15 and the bottom 25% and the bottom 67%. We need to prioritize these matters. But that's the Shantakumar committee was into what is the coverage of the food security. But also you must remember that you must ensure that the grain isn't siphoned off. Ration cards are used as collateral. The FPO actually collects a ration card, and it's just shown as being distributed, but it's simply siphoned off. So we need to address these issues on the expenditure side, and I hope this government will do it. LPG is moving on PEHEL. There's no reason kerosene need not move on a PEHEL-like platform. And eventually on food grains, we should do something along these lines. And fertilizer subsidies, another 100,000 crores. Clearly, the subsidy should go to the farmer and not to the manufacturer. And there's absolutely not iota of efficiency in the present system. I was chair of the fertilizer committee, and I must say I did not succeed in getting anything very much done. But I think that has a crying need. So on the expenditure side, there are many reforms that can be done creatively, if the political will to see it through exists, and there are reasonable solutions which gave us very good results.
So
it was in 2002 when I first started this process, because I was in charge of the food. The first paper we wrote in 2002 was about a food, a 3-pronged attack, which was part of that was what we called a food debit card, which could be used in urban areas and so on, rural areas and areas where there would be no shops at all. We said continue. So you're right to be skeptical of the moves, and consistently since that time I developed these, it was under me that the first study on leakages, I still remember that 38% number which we first got was done. So as I mentioned, the political economy is very important. If the political leaders think that they can get more votes by expanding these programs, then it won't happen.
Yeah,
but if they feel that they can get more votes by reducing the corruption, my kind of seat of the pants numbers are 1/3 corruption, 1/3 inefficiency.
Absolutely.
So you can actually double the amount you actually deliver to the
people
people by reducing it to half of what it is.
But as you see the promises being made by the AAP party in Delhi, clearly these are very important political compulsions. But I'm afraid on that note we'll have to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the possible scope for any kind of expenditure cuts in order to achieve that magic number of fiscal deficit for the next fiscal of 3.6%. Arvind, before the break, we were talking about subsidies and saying that, on oil we've been a little lucky, on food there is some hope, and how fertilizers we have a long way to go. But there are other items of expenditure, interest payments, government salaries, which are virtually non-negotiable. So should the government even try to do something? Remember, we've got the 7th Pay Commission due to submit its report. So expenditure on these heads are only going to increase pensions, salaries, interest payments. So what does one do?
So, we've always, the approach has been to start from where you have started. Look at how much we are spending, how many people are there. I think the approach needs to be completely changed, which is to look at what is the e-governance, for example, the Digital India initiative. Now, we can say that we have been talking about this for ages, and we have, but again, I think the political economy has changed because this government and this has taken that as a major initiative. So that is the way to approach it. If you put e-governance into actual practice, then you will see that a number of people become redundant and nobody will object to removing them and dealing with that issue. But to always start from the other end is actually political economy wise a bad thing. So again, I think this is changing. And if the e-governance initiatives are taken forward, it will become very apparent who are the redundant people.
Fair enough,
and so the important thing is to push those, to push the e-governance initiative, to push the benefits to the people, then they will support a reduction in the staff.
Is that really possible, Saumitra? Because every pay commission has recommended hikes in salary. Along with that, they talked about rationalization of staff. And government invariably has accepted the hike in salaries, but never been able to really do very much about rationalization of staff. Even as Arvind says, if you push the e-governance initiative and people are rendered redundant, will the government really be able to do something which it has never done before? Retrench on a mass scale?
I think, it's easier to speak about retrenchment when you are not going to be retrenched, when someone else is going to be retrenched. I think it's not fair. The second issue is that we must remember that most of the administrative expenditures, including pensions in the government, are paid to class 4 and class 3 employees. Class 1 and class 2 employees matter very little. And all the e-governments, etc., basically what you can do, and I think what has already happened, is that there is a freeze on new employment. It's happened with the state governments because they went through a very bad phase between 1999 and 2002 after the previous finance pay commission, and I think central government has also been. And now, if you look at the kind of recruitment, one of our biggest recruitment is police personnel. Now, do you think that we can actually do without less police personnel? I don't think there are realistic alternatives. But I think the combination of actually not recruiting, where someone is retired in due course, not filling their position, if that position is felt to be not really necessary and useful, eventually abolishing it, is actually the right way to do it. You have to go about it slowly and you have to go about it with a human touch. Otherwise, it's simply not right to do it.
This has actually been going on for decades.
It's true,
it's not new. What he is saying,
that is true, but in
at least a decade, I am 100% sure.
I think but it's like in an elected democracy, is it really possible for governments to follow
I
such
don't
tough
think,
medicine?
I mean, you see what's happening. If you are saying, I don't know the latest numbers, but is that ratio of expenditures on personnel still rising? No, I agree.
They are not. If you are speculating, let me say, they are not. And in fact, this has happened. There has been a lot of racket, for example, in the pension scheme.
Yes,
I think that has been closed down. So there are improvements. It takes time, like everything else in India. Nothing happens overnight. There are improvements. Further, if these, let's say these expenditures were not to increase at the same pace as government, over a period of time, we can manage it. I think talking about retrenchment and staff reduction and redundancies and getting rid of people, I mean, it's going to be self-defeating. It's the silliest thing to
nobody here has talked about that. So the second part,
someone to speak about it, it will be silly.
The second part of it, of course, is the the legal system and the police. There is a police, of course, as you know, is a state subject. So really it doesn't have to do with central government, can't do much on that. But again, the point I was making about governance is that, for example, by separating out normal police work from investigation and so on, you can improve the efficiency of the system so that you take the focus away from just manpower to actually delivering justice, right?
Sure.
You've got to investigate, you've got to prosecute, you need to do more on that. to be effective.
Agreed.
So my basic point is, if you improve the effectiveness of government, the other part becomes less important, it becomes less confrontational. Same with legal. Now legal comes in the central part, right? So what is the key thing? We keep focusing on the man part, that is empty, I think it's about 30% vacancy. But again, my point is that you can do much more in management. There was one Chief Justice, if I remember, of the Supreme Court who did it. None of the others have bothered. Which is to have better management system in courts. How you,
which is in fact you're speaking of efficiency.
So it's a governance. It's a governance, management, e-governance issue. If you have all the cases, for example, on tap, electronically, the way you pronounce judgments, the way you handle cases, etc., can all be improved.
They are on tap. The Supreme Court and the High Court.
Saumitra, Arvind talked about improving the efficiency of government expenditure. In fact, we don't have the details of what the interim report of the Bimal Jalan committee has suggested. But according to reports, they say that apparently they talked in terms of improving the efficiency of government expenditure, centrally sponsored schemes, rationalizing DBT, etc. But we've heard of this rationalizing centrally sponsored schemes and cutting down expenditure for a long time.
You've also heard about honest governance, good governance, whatever. That doesn't take away its validity.
Okay.
Now let's talk about centrally sponsored schemes. Last year in February budget, a move was made that to convert the transfers to from societies to the treasury, and that actually would obviate a lot of unspent balances and use money more effectively. There are many ways to improve. The point is to do improvement, not to give recommendations about improvement. It is about implementation of what you recommend. Even I personally believe that committees who are asked to give recommendations should be responsible for the implementation.
Absolutely, Saumitra. But on that note, I'm afraid we have to slip into a very short break. Saumitra would like all committees, and so would I, to follow through on the implementation as well. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the scope for expenditure reduction in a bid to achieve that magic number of the fiscal deficit target. Arvind, one of the second terms of reference, in fact, of this commission is that they should look at the FRBM rules and see if there is scope to rework those rules. Now, what is the sanctity of an act which we've already seen amended once? So should they really recommend a change, or should we have rigid rules and insist that government stick to it, regardless of what it means in terms of expenditure compression, maybe?
So there are two issues here from your perspective. To my memory, the FRBM actually was time limited, and it's over. The actual law was, if I remember the date, something like
8/9 we should have achieved. 8/9 we should have achieved that 3%.
No, but it ends. It is not an indefinite law. It was supposed to, it gave targets till 2007 or 8, I don't remember the exact year. So that in a way is over. That time is over. The law is not framed as a continuous thing. So you need to have another law.
No,
We've just been continuing it.
No, it was amended in 2012 when Mr. Chidambaram, if you remember, he extended the end dates, So that is why the 3.6% target comes from there.
Okay, I missed that. I wasn't here.
I
wasn't here in 2012.
Okay.
But I came at the end. But the second part of it is, for example, there are certain issues which at that time we were not ready for, which is, for example, what do you call it, cyclically adjusted deficit.
Sure.
Now that's a genuine issue. If it needs a debate. If it is agreed that we should set targets in terms of cyclically adjusted numbers, then that would be something to include.
What is your view? You think it's a wise thing to move?
I think we are getting close to it, because we are getting close to some knowledge of what is the medium long-term growth. The basic problem, when you have a rising growth rate, is that you can't set it, because the whole concept is based on a kind of a steady growth rate around which it fluctuates. But if it's going to go up over 5 years, go down, then it becomes a little difficult. So I think we are getting close to the place where we could have a cyclically adjusted deficit.
That will give some more scope on the expenditure side
but
also.
the mistake people made is that you just change this approach without changing the target. Because if you adopt that approach, then you need, in my view, a zero target. Not a 3%.
Fiscal deficit or a revenue deficit?
Yeah, cyclically adjusted deficit.
Fiscal deficit
yes,
zero. What arguing for a balanced budget?
Because you're changing the whole method. That means on certain times when the economy goes down, you may have 3, 4, 5%. So you got to have the average at a more reasonable level. Again, everybody may not agree with that zero number. There are many issues related to that. For example, your credit rating. You know, you are just one notch above junk. So if you, and we have the highest fiscal deficits in the world practically. So if you want to have move towards closer to, you know, the other middle income countries, you have to think of what I just said. If you don't want to, you can say, oh, 53%.
There's a case for a zero fiscal deficit or a zero revenue deficit. I would have thought
he's talking about something else. You see, he's saying that if you had a steady state growth, then at the steady state it would be zero, and at the state where you're above the steady state, it would be positive.
So counter-cyclical kind of
so
spending.
But the point is, look, if you want to give out signals, if you want to manage, so much is my view, manage the government's finances, you have to easy to understand rules. You can't have rules unless people are going to write academic papers and how they can be interpreted. And as far as, you know, for example, you know, these kind of long-term rates and cyclical adjustments, and every time Japan issues another year of data, they revise the previous 20 years. So I don't think we need any one of these things. These are broad numbers. I think people understand it. Nobody is going to say that you targeted 3% and then you got 3.1%. That's not the point. Broadly, these are the kind of directions that you are going to go. It is to create credibility and predictability about the future. If you want to create predictability to the future, you don't want to use it using an item or using a parameter which itself has a statistical error term attached to that. So I think you should have a simple rule, and I think people understand when you are really meaning to stick with it, and people understand when they're not meaning to stick with it. When you sort of find, you know, will find many excuses not to stick with it. I mean, that's an argument that's happening in Europe, there's an argument that's happening in North America.
And politicians will always find a reason, absolutely.
I don't think if you run down politicians, I think economists do it better for them. They are always willing to serve their masters one step further. Which not necessarily, I think politicians' gut instincts are always much more.
They have to face the electorate after all. But I think another recommendation which all expenditure commissions make is that to do away with this distinction between plan and non-plan. How much of a saving or how much of a difference will it make to expenditure? Yes, it's an academic distinction, but if you were to do away with this distinction, will it improve the quality of spending?
See, again, my view is that, you know, when you are not going to have national planning, the whole concept is meaningless in any case. Of course, many, as you said, any sensible person who looks at it knows the economics of it. The economics has to do with consumption expenditures and capital expenditures. So that has been the recommendation of every single commission. The question is, why is not adopted? Well, they are vested interests. He is quite right. The vested interest is not always political. You can have intellectual vested interests. You can have bureaucratic vested interests. I mean, for example, I mean, I'm sorry, and to provoke, Planning Commission was a big vested interest. So anybody who is in the Planning Commission, with minor exceptions, would tend to support that plan and non-plan thing. I have a paper which is a Planning Commission paper, so you can check it out.
One last word. How hopeful are you that we can do some sensible rationalization, if not reduction of expenditure, and make a difference to outcomes?
I'm an eternal optimist, so I always think you can do better, and you will do a bit better. We always done a bit better, not necessarily better potential, but certainly you have done better. So I'm quite confident that we will do better.
Okay, so on that very optimistic note, that there is scope, despite what a lot of naysayers may say, there is scope for expenditure rationalization, reduction, and so we really should not give up hope. Thank you so much, both Saumitra as well as Arvind also. Thank you also for watching, but we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.